So, hello. I'm going to talk about adjudication. I will make some caveats. Firstly, I will do my best to kind of tailor this to a range of kind of levels, whether you've done no adjudicating or quite a bit of adjudicating. Hopefully there'll be something useful for everyone here. The other thing is, and I said this at the last training I did around development kind of and progress as a debater, even if you don't really think judging is for you, I strongly encourage you to do it, because I think at the very least it will be very helpful for your debating progress, because it allows you to look at what other debaters may be not doing quite as well and reflect on that and incorporate that into your own speaking. But on that note, I hope that even if you have no intention to judge after this, aspects of this seminar or whatever will still be useful to apply to your debating. But judging can be rewarding in and of itself, so if you've not done it already, I really encourage you to have a go. So I'm going to just start off with some more basic things, and then I'm probably going to ramble a little bit on my own thoughts and philosophy before kind of stepping you through a few different resources that are out there, how to kind of improve your own judging from here on out. So I'm just going to kind of skim past these first few slides. I'm going to assume that everyone here has a very, very basic level of familiarity with the British parliamentary feedback in terms of, and as well some of the key differences between this and the 3-on-3 format, that being the order that teams speak in, and so on, POIs, all that fun stuff, okay? But if you have any general questions about those basics, let me know. So I'm sure a lot of you know this already. This is just a very, very high level conceptualization about what it is overall judges do. You are taking notes, keeping order of the debate, namely if you are chairing the debate, enforcing rules, making sure people don't speak over time, dealing with technical issues if you're judging online, which is obviously was a lot more common in sort of COVID era, but still is the case now, and generally just keeping flow of who you think is winning the debate, generally over metrics of how robust analysis is, how important arguments are, and how well those arguments are engaged with. This is all very similar at a conceptual level to how you would judge a normal 3-on-3 debate. So all of these general aspects apply regardless of whether it's a 3-on-3, BP, or kind of any other format really. So that's, again, very basic conceptual. The thing that's really important in BP, although it obviously is still important in like Australs style, but I think is, all the more emphasized in BP, is that holistic judging is basically taking everything in the debate that happened and being comparative. So what do I mean by that? What are some examples? Closing government is derivative. Their extension is so similar to opening government. Does that mean they fourth? Maybe. Not necessarily, because maybe another team in the debate did something worse, right? So again, there's no kind of, one size fits all solution in BP judging. Everything is a comparative exercise. So again, the whip brought in new material. Does this mean they lose? Maybe, maybe not. It just depends on the debate. So that's kind of what the idea of holistic judging refers to. It's about not applying very static rules and understandings you might have of debating and just enforcing that very rigidly in the debate. It should inform how you judge the debate, but it shouldn't, definitively guide the way that you make decisions. I hope that kind of makes sense so far. And obviously it's about applying standards equally. So as much as you penalize one team for maybe not analyzing an argument particularly well, you should apply that same standard against any other team in the debate. So again, I know it seems so obvious, but it is a thing that a lot of judges miss. This is probably a term that you've heard already, but this is useful for both judges to be aware of and especially debaters. Basically, the standard that any judge should be judging from is that of the average intelligent voter. What is that person? You do not have any preformed views about the topic. You do not come from anywhere in the world in particular, so we don't assume you to be Australian or from a Western country or whatever. Whilst you aren't, equipped to understand very technical vocabulary, whether that be about finance or law or like literally any area, you do still have a general understanding of current affairs, history, and what is going on in the world. Now, there's always going to be a bit of a fine line as to what constitutes something an average intelligent voter knows and not. And I've literally had world's final decisions come down to and split votes based on like literal differences in that interpretation. So it's not something that is always clear, but in general, there are probably 90% of examples that can be very clearly delineated, and then the other 10% is a little bit more tricky. So, you know, I think an average intelligent voter would absolutely know that there is a conflict occurring in the Ukraine. An average intelligent voter would absolutely know that Joe Biden is president and those sorts of things. And then there's very niche knowledge, and then, you know, this, again, stuff that's in the middle. I think one of the, I'll just be kind of blunt in saying this, one of the very common pitfalls that debaters make is assuming that just because something is not in the Western media, that it's like incapable of, like it's, that an average intelligent voter would be incapable of kind of knowing that fact. I've literally heard a debater be like, this debate should have no relevance to examples in Africa because no average intelligent voter reads news about Africa. I think it's obviously true in some instances that those things don't have the same prevalence, but a blanket statement like that, I would not encourage you to go down the route of. So long story short, this is the perspective you judge something by as well. And for that reason, if someone is giving you a factual claim in the debate that you feel very strongly the average intelligent voter should know, it's probably not on that debater to then have to prove with like 3 structural reasons why this argument is true. You should be able to probably credit that argument on the face of it. Whereas if it's a very technical example, you're not sure, it pays for the debater to do a little bit more analytical work to prove that that fact has basis. Does that make sense? So that's how you come at it from a judge perspective, but equally that's what you should keep in mind as a debater. Okay? But yeah, like long story short, the average intelligent voter is not a technical expert, but nor are they a complete dummy. They do know some things, they are capable of following persuasion and those sorts of things. Okay, I'll probably just skip this bit because it's kind of a little bit outdated now in the sense that this was like a very major change to the world's judging manual a little bit ago, but it's kind of fairly well known now, I want to say. We'll get to in a second what the world's judging manual is and why maybe you should give it a skim. But long story short, the key takeaway here is that POIs have a particular importance in terms of their functionality in the debate. So again, something you should consider as a debater, but also something that you ought factor in as a judge. So basically, long story short, debaters should accept at least one POI, and judges, if a POI is not taken, can lower speaker scores, adjust the margin of victory, or flip close calls. So those are the things that you are empowered to do as a judge if someone fails to take a POI. How do you determine what is appropriate? You have to kind of use a bit of common sense. If a team is still winning very clearly, you're not going to flip the call simply because they didn't take a POI, but you might dock them a speaker point because that engagement was necessary and they should have engaged, yada, yada, yada. Making sense so far? And sorry, I should say please interrupt at any point if you have questions. Okay. I'm probably going to skip over this unless anyone has any particular questions, but long story short, I could go on a whole spiel about different motion types and how they have certain types of burdens and implications. This is a really complicated area, especially if you're someone that maybe isn't as familiar with this. Long story short, there are a lot of resources I will note at the end that can give you more guidance about what the particular burdens from different motion types might infer, but we're kind of, you know, just as like a headliner, we're talking about, you know, as an actor motion, you have to prove that the thing is right from the actor's perspective. As a policy motion, you have to implement a model, whereas as a values motion, you maybe don't have to. Those are the sorts of things I'm talking about, but that literally is like, you know, an hour presentation in and of itself, so I won't go into it as much here, but other than just to note that this is a useful thing for you to be aware of both as a debater and a judge. Okay? But judges should penalize teams for kind of squirreling debates or setting up things unnecessarily narrowly. And again, there's always a fine line between what is a legitimate and maybe slightly strategic setup of a debate versus something that is illegitimate. But again, you kind of have to use your common sense a bit. So a really, really easy go-to one is like, if the motion is this House would legalize all drugs, and the opening government defines this as we're just legalizing marijuana, that's clearly a squirrel, that's clearly an unnecessary narrowing of the debate, right? And again, there are going to be great examples and less obvious ones, but that is a starting point, I would say. Okay, this is really, really important. This is probably one of the most important things I would emphasize if you're going to get into judging, but obviously something you should also keep in mind as a debater. Obviously, like, let's just be blunt. We come from, I'm not going to assume everyone's like backgrounds, but we come from a space where lots of people are going to be inclined to have like liberal, leftist, possibly views, and that's fine and that's legitimate. But when we go back to our average intelligent voter metric, we cannot assume that that person has any hard political leanings, nor can we assume that they would necessarily prioritize certain types of philosophical argumentation over another, so utilitarian metrics over deontological metrics and those sorts of things. So for that reason, you have to keep in mind that no one type of argument in debates is automatically more persuasive. As a judge, you should be deferring to how well did teams actually prove the mechanisms that underpin their argument, but equally the impacts, right? So if a team that just says, we will have more right-wing populism, just ends their argument at that, maybe you can give them some credit for hinting at an impact, but unless they go on and actually explain why right-wing populism is bad, you ought not just give it default credit, because that's something that, again, the average intelligent voter wouldn't necessarily be like, I know why that's bad, easy done. So that's obviously the case with political arguments, but it goes, for all of these types of comparisons. So again, if a team makes a really compelling principled argument and the team on the other side makes a really compelling practical argument, you have to do some work as a judge to evaluate what is more important. Don't just assume that something with impacts is necessarily more important. It might be if the team does the work to prove that it is, but you have to kind of unpack that a little bit more. And that's the same for like kind of what I mentioned before about fact claims. Maybe a team gives a beautifully analyzed factual analysis, and then another team says, I have 3 structural reasons. Maybe the structural reasons do win, but you cannot automatically assume that's the case. So if all of this has confused you, the long story short is, don't just assume certain types of arguments are more persuasive. You should defer to what teams have said in terms of how they impact and weigh those arguments. And equally, as a debater, you should keep this in mind and not be lazy with the way that you make arguments. Actually take them to their completion, impact them even if you don't think they maybe need impacting. Making sense so far? Cool. Okay, again, really skimming over this because this should be very obvious to people. Style is not irrelevant in debating. You can be persuaded by style to the extent that an argument is more comprehensible, precisely conveys a speaker's meaning, and maybe really sort of riles up the emotional or moral significance of an argument. That is all fine, and that is permissible under the World's Judge Manual, but you should not, obviously give credence to any subjective, assessments of what good style is. The obvious stuff about just because you speak in a preppy, Oxford-sounding accent does not mean you're more persuasive. It's your job as a judge to get past, maybe someone has an accent that you're just less familiar to hearing. That's fine, but you have to do the work in making sure you're sort of overcoming any difficulties you might happen to have there. So, for example, if there is a particular accent that you find a little bit more difficult to follow, the onus is on you to watch more speakers from people who use that accent, or anything like that, right? Because the onus is on you, and people shouldn't be, for like incredibly obvious reasons, not penalized because they happen to speak a little bit differently to you. Okay, that should be like super obvious. I'm not going to spend more time on that. Okay, this is where BP gets a little bit tricky, and this is probably the most pronounced distinction I would say between the 3-on-3 and the BP format. The essence of what this slide is getting at is to say no other team should influence how you evaluate 2 other teams, if that makes sense. So very basically, let's give a very obvious example. If CG has done a really good job at defending the government bench, that does not benefit OG in any way, right? So if at the end of the top half, you have opening opposition winning over opening government, that order remains regardless of what happens in the back half of the debate, right? Like if CG gives a great defense of the government bench, that does not help OG in any way. So you have to evaluate all comparisons independently. So that basically means you're essentially making 6 comparisons in the debate. You're evaluating OG versus OO, you're evaluating CG against OG and then against OO, and then you're evaluating CO against OG, OO, and CG. I know that sounds a bit complicated, and it will become easy with time, and it will become a bit implicit for a lot of you, like you'll just kind of, and sometimes the reasons why a team loses to another team are going to be similar. So let's say everyone had a really impactful contribution in the debate, and then CO was extremely derivative. The reasons why they lose to OG, OO, and CG will probably be broadly similar, right? Like the general reasoning is you were derivative, they had more contribution than you, they had more contribution than you, and they had more contribution than you, but you still have to make that independent assessment, if that makes sense. So yeah, long story short, if you can take anything away from this slide, it's to not let other teams influence how you evaluate the comparison between 2 specific teams, if that makes sense. Again, it's a starting point. It will become a lot easier the more you judge. I think again we can probably skim over all of this. I think generally speaking, people probably have some familiarity with the idea that closing teams can't knife their openings in BP. New material has a broad scope, so as a whip, you can introduce new weighing impacts, mechanisms, examples. You just can't introduce wholly new arguments. Obviously, what the line for that is going to be grey in some instances, but again, use common sense. The key thing that I will kind of note with the top dot point is that it's become an increasing trend in, I want to say, the last like 3-4 years in debating, that in an attempt to weigh over opening, so you're a closing team, right? You want to prove you've beaten your opening government, for example. You say, oh, we have the reason we've rebutted our opposition, and we also think we beat our opening because our impact is bigger, right? That's kind of where it started, but nowadays a lot of closing teams have resorted to actively rebutting their opening in an attempt to weigh over them. This is a bad trend that the Americans do worst of all, and you should not follow their example. It's obviously like a bit of a, again, fine line about what constitutes weighing over your teams versus what is rebutting them, but like, if what you're saying is actively contradicting them, you're probably knifing them. It's probably bad, you probably shouldn't do it. You know, unfortunately, some judges do let speakers get away with this a little bit more than they should, but I want you to fight the good fight and not let this happen, okay? Cool. Equity, again, super quickly, I'll just note that equity is something that should be really dealt with outside of the debate. If someone does something actively unconscionable, that should be the realm of an equity officer to deal with at a tournament, or maybe you have, an internal contact. That being said, obviously something that is objectively offensive is equally unlikely to be persuasive, but you should evaluate it in that context and not be like, well, I'm the chair and you said something offensive, so you get an automatic 4th. You just judge it how you normally would, and then if you need to talk to an equity officer, you do so, but you don't, insert your like grand authority as a judge. You still just judge it as you normally would, noting that it might be less persuasive because it might be offensive, and then other processes deal with that. Okay, so I'm going to kind of focus this now a bit more on the perspective of both chairs and panelists. So, okay, the debate's happened, you've taken notes, you have a rough idea of who you think has won, maybe some order, like some placements you're really sure on, others you're a bit less sure on. So maybe the 4th and the 1st you're set on, but the 2nd and the 3rd's a bit close to you, right? That's fine. So typically the chair will go around the room and they will ask everyone for what their call is, and then guide a deliberation. Okay, starting I guess from the chair's perspective, so if you're chairing a deliberation, achieving consensus in a BP debate is sometimes a difficult feat, right? Like, especially if you have calls from all different directions, right? Like maybe you've got two panelists and one's given the opposite call to each other and you've got a call somewhere in the middle. You have to try to make sense of that, and your goal is to reach some sort of unanimity if you can. And if you can't, then you basically call a vote, and you might have split decisions across various components. And that's fine, that happens sometimes, but where possible, you try to reach consensus. I think that I've personally evolved a bit with how I tend to approach this over the years. Personally speaking, I really like working through the debate chronologically. That makes sense to me because I can't evaluate the closing teams until I know what has been said first in the opening part of the debate. So typically I will do the pairwise comparison I kind of mentioned earlier. I'll start with OG and OO and then I'll work through as it goes. That said, that is sometimes not the most efficient way of constructing a deliberation, especially when maybe latter parts of the decisions are more contentious, but maybe everyone agrees that OO has been OG, right? In those situations, you can do one of two things, I guess. You can skip ahead to the more contentious parts, or you can just try to make that first part of the deliberation as efficient as it can be. So I will sometimes still do that just to get a baseline of what was said in the debate. So I'll say, panelist one, can you give me a 1 minute summary, no more than that, on why you think OO has been OG? And assuming everyone is in agreement with that, we'll just quickly move on. So there are a few different ways you can do it. There's no right or wrong way. And obviously, for a lot of you that maybe haven't judged before, you're not going to start off in this position, so you don't need to stress, but it's just something for you to be aware of, especially because often you'll get chairs that may have to cut you off or may ask for a very short summary, and you're thinking, why are you cutting me off? Let me talk, right? But appreciate it's because they have a job to do. Often at a tournament especially, you'll be constrained with a deliberation time of 15 to 20 minutes. That's not a lot of time, especially once you do all the waffle stuff and fill out the ballots and all of that. So just try to respect that, I guess, as much as possible, and know that that's why they're often doing that. That doesn't obviously excuse rudeness. Chair should still engage all members of the panel in a polite discussion and involve everyone. And if you're not involving all members of your panel, including trainees who don't have a vote, you have failed as a chair. But again, appreciate still that they have a job to do. So yeah, you go through it, you try to reach consensus, and if you can't, there's a skill to just knowing when to kind of call it a day and being like, we're not going to reach consensus, that's okay, let's call a vote, and that's kind of how it is. And you want to leave enough time to complete your ballot. We'll go through speaker scores in just a sec, but that from a deliberation perspective, does that make a bit of sense? I'm going to actually skip over to this bit and then go back. So if you're paneling or a trainee, these are, I guess, the top tips that I would give. One is just be very precise, right? If your chair has asked you to explain the difference between OG and OO, do not go talking about closing half. That's not the comparison that they've asked you to make, and they will be annoyed at you for making that comparison. So stick to what you've been asked at that time. Your chair has hopefully structured the deliberation they want for a reason. So kind of just trust that process. Be as succinct as possible. And I know sometimes you'll feel like, oh, but I have so much more to say. I think the best tip I can give you is give you a baseline justification and then say, but I'm happy to expand on any of that if you'd like me to. And then you've put the onus on the chair to, they can invite you to expand if you want to. But keep it to if they've said, give me a quick justification, give them a quick justification. But be open and flexible. Recognize that no judge is perfect. And let me just see how much time. And probably over. I'll speed up. But yeah, no judge is perfect. We all miss things. So it's important to be, open that you might have missed something, a weighing mechanism, a point of rebuttal. But that being said, if you're not convinced, do not flip just because you feel some degree of pressure. A lot of people might feel convinced to flip their call because they're judging with someone who's reppy or whatever. If you're just not convinced, you shouldn't change your vote. And I will respect someone, even if I think maybe their call is maybe not 100% correct, I will respect someone more for sticking to their guns than just flipping because I think they want to please the judge or something. And I know when someone's done that, right? Because if they're just like, yeah, I'm happy to flip, and they leave it at that, I know that they're not fully convinced. Whereas if they say to me, and again, tip number 2, if you have been convinced, this is what I would say. On second thoughts, I'm happy to come around. With reflection, I realize I probably undercredited that aspect of the rebuttal or didn't factor in, blah, blah, blah. So explain why you've changed your mind, because that will convince the judge that you've actually reconsidered things. You're not just like changing your mind because you thought, I better, or else the judge is going to be peeved at me, okay? Cool. So that's that. So we won't have time to go through this in a lot of detail, but long story short, if you are voting and you need to fill out a ballot, this is what we call the speaker scale. You can look at it a lot more in your own time, but it's really important to be familiar with this if you especially are planning to judge competitively. Like this will be, you'll get links to this at any tournament you judge, so you don't have to worry about, oh no, I don't know where to find this. But long story short, speakers. Look, very, very quickly on OAs, what's the key takeaways that I want to sort of emphasize here? I think, look, a good OA is both comprehensive and succinct, which is one of the hardest things you can do. And you know, I'm super guilty of this. Like my OAs go way too long. I really try hard to keep them under 20 minutes, but even then I struggle. So really a BP OA is probably going to be a little bit longer than a 3-on-3 OA, just because you've got more teams to get through. But really any longer than 15 minutes is probably not the best bet. And just as a comment on like how things have changed, back when I started debating, which is a very long time ago, I want to say the meta was a lot different. When I say the meta, I'm referring to like the norms in the circuit at the time. When I started, it was very much, you explain why first got first, then you explain why second got second, and third got third, and fourth got fourth. Nowadays, it is a little bit different. The very common methodology, and this is not, I want to say that, you know, you have to do this, but I'm just telling you what is common, is judges will often do that complete chronological assessment of the debate. Firstly, how was the front half resolved? Then they'll discuss CG and how CG fared against the two teams in front, and then they'll bring in CO and then compare CO to every other team, which again does require you to essentially make 6 different comparisons in a 15-minute window, which is not always easy to do. So I want to say try and test the different OA styles at the point where you are giving OAs and kind of see what sits and works for you. Not everyone will do it that way. Again, I'm just telling you more just to be aware of. And remember that sometimes you can, even though again, every comparison should be based on that, you know, pairwise comparison, you can still use aspects of the reasoning in multiple comparisons. So again, I'll just use that same example of if a CO was completely derivative, no extension, you're probably going to use a similar rationale for their comparison against all the other 3 teams. Just try not to repeat that too much. Like, so CO, you lost to OO because you were derivative. CO, you lost to OG because you were derivative. CO, you lost to CG because you were derivative. See if you can kind of package it in a way that's a little bit more efficient than that, while still acknowledging that comparison has to be made to all 3 teams. If this is totally overwhelming at this stage, don't worry about it. Chances are you'll have time to practice OAs in less stressful settings, and you'll have time, you know, if you're just starting out, to watch judges give OAs and be very precise about it. And honestly, like, it's taken years for me to get to a point where I'm comfortable with the OAs I'm giving, so don't stress at all. This is just basically how judges are scored. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail because you probably don't need to worry about it anytime soon. But long story short, judges are also scored on how they deliberate and give OAs. I've done that. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it as far as the general summation is concerned. I just want to quickly note a few really key resources that I think will be sort of helpful for you on your judging journey. So the first is, this was the complete judge and debater briefing from the last World Championships. And it goes into what I kind of just covered in a lot more detail. But what is very interesting and fun is, oh my God, it's so long. Why do we make it so long? we do a judge test, right? Most major tournaments will have a judge test that you have to do to check your theory of judging, you understand broadly correctly. So this can be a useful thing to do yourself to kind of just test where you are at. Maybe a little bit more difficult to do here because the answers are actually in here. But yeah, so you can find this on the Madrid World's Facebook page, or I can like send out a dossier after this to be sent out or something. So yeah, very useful resource. Another thing is, oh my God, sorry, there's so many. I'm gonna close your thing. Another thing that was on the Madrid Worlds page, so this was the Worlds that just happened, to be clear. So what is often like missing from, I think, the pack of debate resourcing is we often have videos of debates online, but very rarely do we see the process behind the scenes. So one of the things that I was very proud of that we were able to do for Madrid is we filmed an entire debate from start to finish. That was all 4 teams' preps. Then we filmed the debate, then we filmed the deliberation, and then we filmed the oral adjudication. So if you want to watch a really high level version of all of that, I recommend going to the page. That's a great resource. And what else? Sorry, again, I will try to keep your privacy somehow. And then we also compiled all the feedback that judges got over the tournament, so like a million different data points, and then surmised it into the key trends for judges and like the key things judges were doing well and that judges were doing wrong, and things that, you know, resulted in a judge getting very good scores versus maybe more average scores. So this is another thing that I'd suggest you could read. And what else? There's just like so many resources online. Honestly, it can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes with the amount of content that is up there. But there is a lot, so, you know, I encourage you to explore. Start with like, you know, the pages of majors and kind of work from there. Like even Career Worlds, going back like 2 worlds ago, had a really great what's the word I'm looking for? Dossier of videos on how to track and take notes as a judge, which is really useful as a resource if that's something that you struggle with. So there's just so much out there, but I think I'll leave it there. I can, sorry, I'm a bit over, but I can answer any quick questions if anyone has them. But yeah, just hopefully, you know, you retain some of that and really just start out and don't worry too much. Like, judging's hard, and just give it a go, and I'm sure you'll improve. So. Cool. Yep, that's it. Any quick questions? But I'm happy to stop as well. You'll want to just get into things. Would that be, maybe I can send out like a just a quick compilation of resources you guys can flick out somewhere, just because it's like you're probably not going to remember how to find all of these things that I'm telling you about. So cool. But also just message me on Facebook, and I'm like really happy to just like cold call, you know, answer any random questions you have. So cool. All right.